All right, thank you very much for attending Worldwide Slot Car Chat number 12. That means we've been doing this for 3 months already, and no sign of stopping now. I'm your host, Greg Galb, also known as Mr. Flippant, a Seattle area 132nd skilled hard body slot car racer, partaking in both analog with an analog club and digital with a digital club. But as most of you will agree, I'll race anything if you put a controller in my hand and in front of a slot car table. Before we move on, I did want to do a kind of memorial for my friend Dave. Some of our watchers will know him as the Rockinator. Dave Rock was an HO racer in the area for quite a long time. Big hydro fan. Switched to 132nd scale racing with my digital club about 10 years ago because it got too hard to see the little cars. He was a great guy. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple weeks ago. Not COVID related, just health issues. I don't see anybody else on here who I know knew him in person, but I welcome anybody to speak on his behalf. I might touch on that again later, but I just kind of wanted to say a thank you for being a great guy to Dave, and condolences to his family and all his friends. And it sucks losing a friend and a racer, and hopefully we don't keep doing that quite so much. I don't like it. But moving on, I will have everybody who's been here before do quick introductions. Looks like pretty much everybody is a returning guest, so why don't we go ahead and start with Kelly and have you do a quick introduction.
Yes, I'm Kelly Avery in Omaha, Nebraska. On a lot of the forums, I'm known as Genie2369. And I race 132nd digital, but I will race anything. Just like Greg, if you put a controller in my hand, I'll drive it. So that's pretty much me. And next person.
All right, thanks, Kelly. John, why don't you go ahead?
Oh, okay. My name's John Kidd. I'm from Toronto, Canada. I have a little YouTube show called Scale Car Garage. If you can check it out, please view, like, and subscribe. And I'm going to have to actually play Uber here from my daughter, who's actually working today. So I just thought I'd get this in. Thanks for letting me know. And I'll be back.
All right. See you when you get back, John. Lance, why don't you give us a quick intro?
Yeah, in my childhood, I had some small 132nd scale. I believe it was Eldon slot cars back then. Had some small Tyco stuff. Got out of it when, went to school and stuff like that. Every now and then I visit the local track where I was living at, commercial track. It would kind of reignite my interest in running slot cars. They run a lot of fast wing car type stuff, which kind of too fast for me. So I run my 132nd scale when they're not running that 124th stuff. And right now I'm doing proxy racing because there's really no slot racing where I'm living, and just doing proxies as many as I can.
Thank you very much for sharing, Lance. And Mr. Schwartz, would you like to intro? You're still muted, by the way.
Al Schwartz here, aka Ecurie Martini. Been around this game since probably some of you were simply plans in your parents' eyes. I would like to quickly shout out a hello to Dennis. I don't think we've seen each other since Arizona many years ago.
Alan, it's good to see you, man. Wow.
It's good to see you too. And
yeah.
My hat's off to one of our premier builders and innovators. Good to see you on here, Dennis.
Yeah, it's great to be here. It's great to see you. Alan and I first met in 2005 at a slot car convention in Chandler, Arizona. And we've met up a couple of times since then. One time when I was in Pennsylvania, on some training courses up around Philly, just outside of
right.
Philly. I drove down. I did like a 4-state drive all in one night. I drove all the way down to Baltimore to him, and we ran a couple of laps on his track, then drove all the way up to New Freedom, Pennsylvania, to Jim Butt's track, and drove some there, and then I drove all the way back to Philly that night.
That's right. I'd forgotten that.
I did like about 400 miles in that evening. It's good to see you, man.
Alan, are you done? I'll take that as a yes. Looks like you're a little lagged today for some reason. Dennis, since you've already spoken, why don't you go ahead and give us the year, make, and model of Dennis?
Okay. I'm Dennis Sampson in Irvine, California, by way of Johannesburg and Pretoria, South Africa originally. Been racing slot cars on and off since about 1963, so I can give Alan a little bit of a go, but not entirely. Got out of slot cars for a while in the 90s and raced radio control cars, and then in the aughts I got back into slot cars because radio control just got too expensive. And so I run a lot of 1/32 scale because that's where my original love is. I run a lot of 1/24 scale retro because that's one place where I could still build, and effectively I race so that I can build. That's my big deal. But I have a terrible addiction to little plastic cars, so I spend a lot of time on Home Racing World as well, and I really do enjoy. This is my second meeting with you guys, and I really do enjoy it. Thanks for having me, and it's great to be able to talk to everybody.
And thanks for joining us, and we'll definitely be picking your brain later and having you re-show off those excellent things you were showing off earlier. Andy, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, everybody. Andy Pinchok, DVD 3500 on most of the forums, sometimes Carrera ARP. Originally from Michigan. I've lived for over 20 years in Germany, not far from the Hockheim Ring. And I will also race pretty much anything. We primarily race digitally at home. Here in Germany, 1/24 scale racing, mostly on wood tracks, but of course on Carrera track is most popular. And this could be the last time I'm ever on the call because our club's reopening next week, or at least the series is that I race in will open up. So unless it's a series that I don't race in, I'm going to be here less and less often.
Well, part of me wants that to happen and part of me doesn't want that to happen. So I guess we're just going to have to be split on that. Looks like we have a couple of new users, but let's go ahead and finish our returning guests with Wayne, and then we'll get to Sean and Leo.
Hi all, Wayne Pepper, obviously, Pepsi 62 on the forums from Queensland in Australia, primarily 132, mostly analog, a little bit of digital here and there. And yeah, I think we're having our first crack back again tomorrow night on a brand new 4-lane Carrera setup that one of the guys has put up. So that'll be fun.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing, Wayne, and hopefully everybody's still remaining safe when they get together and race each other. Now, Sean and Leo, I'll welcome you guys to introduce yourselves. I have a terrible memory, but I don't think either one of you have been on before. You're welcome to share as much or as little as you want about yourself and your slot car history. If you've seen some of our past videos, you've probably seen some of us go on and on for quite some time, and that is perfectly fine, whatever you want to share. So I'll go ahead and let Sean go first. Well, tell us about yourself, Sean.
Well, I'm Sean from Peterborough, UK. Go to Rockingham Slot Car Club, which is a 4-lane wooden track. Do some digital as well, Oxygen Digital at Rockingham and some of the other venues in the UK. And I race 1/24 dragsters down with a bloke called Mr. D down south, well, we call down south, which is near London Way. So, yeah, I race with Mr. Underwood, but he's not on tonight. Yeah.
All right.
So that's me.
Perfect. Thank you for joining us, Sean, and thanks for sharing. Leo, would you like to tell us about Leo? You're muted. There you go.
Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yep, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm a home racer, so I don't have much experience like you guys do, so I'm not too sure I can contribute an awful lot to this, but however, enjoyed the conversations up to now, I thought must do my duty and participate as well. So here I am. I live just outside Edinburgh in Scotland. As I say, a home racer, pretty much, don't race because I don't have anyone to race with. I do host a couple of proxy events, which is great fun because I get a chance to drive other people's cars, and that's very enjoyable. But however, in terms of long experience in clubs and things like that, I'm afraid I don't have that. Although I've been with slot cars for many years, I don't have an in-depth experience, should we say. I say just home experience for my own pleasure, basically. I guess what I am is a slot car enthusiast, not a racer. But however, hello everybody, and thank you for the competitions up to now. Excellent stuff.
All right, thanks for joining us, Leo. And I mean, every facet of slot cars is a good facet, and however you enjoy the hobby or are able to enjoy the hobby is a good way to enjoy the hobby.
The other thing that's nice about guys like Leo is when they start talking, I get Pink Floyd playing in my mind. Love the accent, Leo. Thank you.
I'm more of a Beatles fan, to be honest.
I love hearing all your accents. I don't have an accent. All of you guys have accents, so it's fun listening to you. All right. Is there anybody on audio only that would like to give us an intro? I don't see.
I saw Chris Walker out there.
Oh, he never does an intro. He's just here to be helpful. Unless you want to give an intro, Chris, I'll let you.
Hi.
Hi. There you go.
I will do a little intro.
Okay.
I have been playing with toy cars since 1961. I've played with HO, 32nd, 24th. My love is 24th. Like Dennis, I love to race and I love to build. And over time, I was trying to figure that out the other day. I think I worked at 7 commercial tracks on and off as a high school student. And then when I retired, I've worked at 2 or 3 more. So predominantly 32nd scale now, because that's where sort of the market is with club racing. Although that could very well change in Toronto in the next couple of months, as there is a new commercial track opening with a brand new Steve Ogilvy track. So if that's the case, I'll be back to some 24 scale racing.
Are you going to be working there?
Well, yeah, I would like to. I'm not sure how much time at this. If you said today, would you work there? No, I wouldn't. I mean, we'll see how things progress and, you know, the safety of the whole thing. I mean, the timing's bad for a commercial track because, you know, having 1 or 2 guys at a time, it's really not much fun. So the answer is I have been asked to, I plan to, but, you know, day by day we'll have an answer yes or no. So
there you go. When it feels safe to.
Well, that's, you know, unfortunately, when you look up and down here, my camera's still buggered up, and actually it's not bad. I really don't look much different than Dennis Sampson. So if you just sort of look at him, you can sort of get an idea of what I look like. So having the camera broken is not a bad thing. But no, guys our age are not, you know, we're not the prime guys to be looking at getting COVID. So extra precautions for us.
We both have good faces for radio.
Sorry?
Yeah, we both have good faces for radio.
Well, I don't even know if yours is good for radio, Dennis.
All right. Thank you very much for telling us some more about yourself, Chris. And Nick has joined us. Nick, you want to give us your quick bio?
Good evening, everybody. Hope you're all well. I'm Nick. I'm from Northampton in UK, not far from Silverstone, actually, about 15 miles away from Silverstone. I race at Rockingham with Sean and John Underwood, who comes on here sometimes. Race 132 on wood, normally on a weekly basis, but we're still closed, and do the Disca Oxygen digital racing as well. That's me.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks for joining us again. I think that covers everybody who's here and able to do an intro. If there's somebody on mic only, feel free to just jump in on me. I'm not going to go to a topic right away because Mr. Sampson has some show and tell to do. So we're going to let him basically redo what he did for us prior to the beginning of the recording because he didn't know we weren't recording apparently, and that's okay. So Dennis, I'll let you take it away, and everybody else, what I'm going to do is set it to speaker view. So on the recording, it's going to be full screen. So I ask you not to speak or ask questions of Dennis until after he's done with his presentation, because otherwise your face comes forward and we don't see what he's talking about. He might answer your question anyways, so wait until he's done, and then we'll have everybody ask whatever questions he didn't get to. You want to take it away, Dennis?
Yep, okay. I'm going to disconnect my ears right now, and then I'm going to change over it onto a different camera. Because what I want to show the guys that weren't on when I showed it earlier is this. All right, can you hear me still?
Yep.
All right, let me turn the volume up again because now I'm on my PC speakers only. All right, this is a little gymkhana track that I built during the coronavirus pandemic down here and the shutdown. It's on a 6 foot by 4 foot board that splits in the middle to make 2 3 foot by 4 foot pieces that store behind my workbench in my garage. And when I take them out, they sit on top of a banquet table. Excuse me. It's a single lane track that can run on DC. I have a DC power supply hooked up, and I have a reversing switch, so I can run in both directions. So it's quite fun just to test cars or to play around with a couple of little cars. Short little cars work better. Excuse me. But I can also run it on AC. I have a AC power supply that hooks in, and then there are a set of diodes underneath the track in the wiring, and sets of diodes in 2 cars, so that you can actually hook up 2 controllers, 2 cars, and control them independently in a single lane. It's similar to the AC, well, it is the AC 2-car system, or what Eldon used to have. I think John called it a Selectomatic or something like that back in the 60s, not that I remember that. Anyway, so this is what I got, and I thought I'd just run a lap or two, 2 cars just to show you how they work. So we started here, basically half a lap apart, and then as we go, this is what happens. Because the lengths are different, the first car hits the changeover point much before the second, but when you get around the second lap, then the cars are almost back together again. So you would be able to run 2 people, one at each end. There's another connector at the other end of the track, and you would run in much the same way as the International Race of Champions, the stadium races run, except of course those things have a bridge. And I didn't want to go to the extra complexity of putting a bridge on this one. So I just made that little crossover. But that's what I got. So I guess if anybody wants to make, has some questions, go for it, and I'll answer what I can. And carry the camera around if you want to look at something closer up.
You want to show us your connection mechanism you showed us earlier?
Sure. Okay, so the track itself splits down the middle here, and there are a couple of over-center clamps, one on each side. They clamp it together. The braid on the track is passed down across the abutting surfaces. So as you clamp it together, the braids connect, and that gives you the connectivity all the way around. There's a power supply here that's set up right now, and adjustable, so I could play with the amount. There's a reversing switch, and then that's on the DC side. If I want to run AC, I disconnect all of that. I move the little shelf over to the other side of the track, and on this side, that hooks up. I put an AC power supply in there. I connect the AC into two little connectors here, different to those, so that I never get them mixed up. And there's one little connection under the track that has to bring the power back to that side, so that two controllers will work. You'll notice on the AC, on the DC side, there are 3 connections, so that I've got brakes on the DC side, and that's the only problem with the AC system always, is that you can't wire brakes in, because you're running on two, each car's running on a half of a wave and half the rectified wave, and the cars have diodes in them, so as soon as you've got a diode in there, you get no brakes. But on a short track like that, it's not really a problem not to have the brakes.
Now, I think you mentioned earlier that you put the diodes for the controllers into the wiring, not in the controllers. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, it's not necessary to put the wiring. If you've got the wiring in the power, you put sorry, let me get back on here. It's probably better. You put the wiring, you put the diodes into the wiring. So the controllers that I'm using are just standard Farmer 25 ohm turbos, or I can use I could use pretty much any other controller. Because of the way that it's done, the polarity through the controller is always correct. So sometimes I'll use Professor Motor diode controllers, things like that. I don't bother with high-end controllers on a short little track like that. The 25 ohm Palmers work great. They never get warm anyway. So that's my
I love the G2 car.
little contribution.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing. Does anybody have any other questions for what he did, how he did it? I guess everybody here is familiar with AC2 car. Sean, go ahead.
Do you use a Scale Electric 360 cars on there and be like a big kid and a hooligan?
Oh, yeah, that would
spin around.
I don't have any of those, but I was thinking about that. That'd probably be great for.
Yeah, no, it brings out the big kid in you, because
absolutely.
I built a track similar to yours 10 years ago. I've been looking for it, and if you can, oops, not that one. You always lose it when you. Hang on. Yeah, I built a track similar to yours 10 years ago,
mm-hmm.
and I used to go to a real small club with a lot of children, and we used to. I built it specifically for the 360 Scale Electric cars, and the people who got the most enjoyment out of it was the dads.
Yeah.
They'd stand around there, they'd stand there and just do donuts till the wheels fell off, basically. And it just brings out the big kid in you, because I built something similar,
mm-hmm.
And that's really good fun.
Yeah,
I don't know if you've tried that before.
I haven't. I don't have any of those cars, but a friend of mine has one or two. I must actually borrow them and try them on this track.
Yeah, well, I've bought quite a few since I built it, and like I say, it is it's surprising how much. It's surprising. Oh, there we go. I found it now. All right, hang on. I don't know if you can see that. My grandchildren had a birthday around our house, and I got it out for them to play with it in the garden.
Oh, shit, that's great.
Yeah, I don't know if you can you see that okay?
Yeah. How big is that?
It's not very big. That was the first truck I ever built. That was about 10 years ago in 2010. I made it out of 19 mil MDF, and which was a mistake now, because it was very, very heavy. But I got some, the new the Scale Electric cars, what they use, a lot Lego type ones now, what disintegrate, not break. You break up if you hit them. I've got a couple of cars for him on there, and he just loves them because he likes the destruction of it, as well as they spin around as well. So, like I say, if you try the 360 cars, it just brings out the big kid in you.
Good thinking. I'll try that sometime. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, they
That's
do
all
that.
I got.
I've
Yeah.
got a couple of those cars, and they're a hoot.
Yeah.
So when
Yeah.
you got enough room to
So,
spin them around.
yeah. I know it's not racing, but like I say, it's fun.
Thank you very much for the show and tell, Dennis. And before we move on, does anybody else have any questions for Dennis? Anybody microphone only got any questions for Dennis? All right.
Yeah, I got one real quick. Hey, Dennis, what AC power supply are you using since you're only using half of the AC signal?
I bought one on Amazon. It's a 20 volt. I have it right here in my hand. It's
Okay.
it's 24 volt, and it's a 50 VA, so it provides like about 2 amps, which is enough. And at 24 volts, because you're only using half of the way for each car, the cars only get 12. But even that was a little much. So instead of just having one diode in the circuit, I think I have 3, so that I dropped the voltage down from 12 down to about 10, or just under 10, and then the cars run really nice. But remember, there's one diode in the car as well, so that drops the voltage another 0.7 volts. So I've got like four diodes in series, and so it drops the voltage down. So the 24 volt power supply works great.
Very cool. I never thought about how it cuts the voltage. The AC supply gets cut.
Yeah, there's always, when you pass voltage through a diode forward, it always loses between 0.7 and 1 volt, depending on the problem. Oh, I see. There's a text about how do they sound. They have a funny growl to them. They don't sound the same as the normal slot car. It's a much lower, and as you correctly said there, it's a pulsing sound. So yeah, it's a little different.
All right. Does anybody have any other questions before I pick from my bucket of topics? Don't really have a very deep bucket today, but I'll read a suggestion that was made because we do have the guests that he was referring to. So this was the post that I got on one of the forums. Since the like of Al, Chris, and Dennis are together, I would love to hear a discussion on scratch building, specifically soldering techniques and how to flow solder where you want it without getting it where you don't want it. If that morphs into chassis design, all the better. So who would like to just kind of give their favorite tips and tricks for scratch building? It sounds like chassis were where he was at. Who wants to take a crack at that one?
Let Chris start. I've done enough.
You've been nominated, Chris.
Okay. Won't get into chassis design at this point. Just can do, and that's actually one of my favorite topics. But soldering is, you need some basic stuff. You need a minimum of a 40-watt iron with a good 1/4-inch chisel tip on it. It has to be tinned and cleaned. For 99% of the stuff that everyone on this forum is doing, which is 32nd scale home type racing, a 60/40 rosin solder is absolutely perfectly fine. You don't need to go to silver solder. It's better, but it's got its own associated issues with temperatures and things like that. Thirdly, is everything's got to be clean to get solder to stick. Solder won't stick to anything that's dirty. And in soldering, dirty is very, it's not dirty because it fell on the floor and it's got, dog saliva on it or whatever. It's got to be meticulously clean. So you need to hit everything with a Scotch brake pad or Ajax or sandpaper or a scouring cloth. particularly piano wire, because it comes with an oily coating on it from day one. So you've got to clean everything else. For any mechanical type join, you really need liquid acid flux. Once you know how your iron works, and depending on how thick the brass on the wire is, you can kind of sort of get away with some rosin paste. But flux, liquid acid flux, what it does, it basically, it lets the solder flow. I mean, you see some guys that solder and it looks like craters on the moon on some of the chassis, right? So, and it's not because they're bad guys or doing the wrong things. They just don't have enough heat. They're not using the right flux. So once you have figured out how your iron works and you use acid flux, less solder is always better. And the solder just turns to water and flows. And lastly, on building, it's very important when you cut your pieces or bend your pieces, you really need the pieces to be as close together as possible. So spend a lot of time bending your brass, test fitting how the bends work on piano wire, because solder is a reasonably good gap filler, but it's hideously weak. So if you've got a gap and you're looking at it, don't solder it. Get your pliers out again and adjust your bends so that you have almost the minimal amount of gaps between the whole thing. And then basically, try it again, and try it again. I think it's sort of like if you've ever watched a plumber do the plumbing work. You've got to get, you just don't have to get the solder hot. You've got to get either the piano wire or the brass hot, so that will let the solder flow. So a solder joint on thin brass with a really hot iron and good flux takes seconds. But quite often, if I'm soldering 064 brass, or I mean, if I'm doing that, I would normally use a torch, but I mean, I do use an iron on it. It takes a while to heat that whole joint up because the solder won't stick well to cold surfaces, and it's sort of like the plumber's thing. The hot brass melts the solder as opposed to the other way around. So without getting into any designs, those are the sort of the basics of how to stick two pieces of metal together with some solder. So I'm sure someone else has probably got something that I forgot or missed there.
I think John has a question.
Yeah, Chris, so how often do you use a torch? Because I find using a torch to be more beneficial than a soldering iron, because I tend to move the pieces when I use a soldering iron, whereas with a torch I can have everything set up and hit it with a torch, and my daughter taught me this. How often do you use a torch versus a soldering iron?
It's not the complexity of the chassis, it's the thickness of the material for me. I build everything on a jig, and everything is largely not, I mean, every once in a while you find a finicky piece that you got to sort of hold it with your fingers and get blisters on your fingers because of the iron. But generally, everything is in a jig and either taped down or screwed down with some of the holders on the jig. So if I'm doing 24 scale steel cars or I'm doing thicker brass, I will use the torch. But I've been using an iron since, I was building chassis when I was 12. Not well, I mean, they look, but I had this hot thing in my hand since I was 12, so I've been stabbing it, soldering bits and pieces for a long time. So I sort of get the hang of it. I mean, you watch, there's some videos out there of Tony P and a bunch of guys who are like prolific chassis builders. Sorry, I've got and the way they work the iron and the solder and stuff, it's just like a surgeon doing stuff. So you do get better with time. So I do use a torch. I've got a couple of different irons. I've got a 40-watt iron, and I also have a 60-watt Hako iron that is great. So I don't really use the torch much.
So within the irons that you have, do you also have different tips that you use as well?
I basically use a 1/4-inch chisel tip for everything. And a 1/4-inch chisel tip, I can turn it sideways, so just sort of the side point is working. So if I'm doing lead wires or something like that, you know, I'm fine with the corner. But I find there's been more chassis built with 1/4-inch chisel tips than any other thing known to man. And I would tell you right now, if you're using one of those little circuit board things that looks like a little pointed thing, get rid of that. You're not going to do anything with that bloody thing. Last thing is with flux. I forgot to say, flux is for all of your mechanical connections and needs to be washed off within 10 or 15 minutes after your soldering, or you'll just corrode all the metal. For any electrical connections, use just a rosin-based paste.
So Chris, how do you wash? Like, do you have a particular methodology for washing it?
Any sort of any Ajax and a toothbrush.
That's it?
Yeah, that's like you can't beat that. It's the best thing in the world. Ajax or Comet and a toothbrush, and you're good to go.
Any other questions for Chris before we have Alan do his show and tell and have any dissenting? Go ahead, John.
So no, one more for Chris. Chris, how often do you solder your motor in your chassis versus just sort of use screws or some other method of keeping it in place?
Again, depending what I'm racing. Plastic cars don't do well with soldered in motors, obviously, because the pods don't do well. So any chance I have, if given a brass bracket or a metal bracket, any chance I have, I will always solder the motor. More often than not, in the stuff that I'm doing, you know, arts and all the local Toronto area clubs, if I can, I will use 2 machine screws to put the motor in. Failing that, a little bit of shoe glue or something, but there's always got to be something holding the motor in to eliminate you know, stuff. Any 24 stuff, modern type 24 stuff, wing cars, flexi cars, whatever, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. Everything's soldered in.
Thank you very much for your expertise, Chris. And I think, Alan, are you ready to do some talking on that?
Yeah, I'm pretty much on the same page as Chris, but perhaps even more to an extreme. I started out soldering stuff and models probably in 1948, 1949 in model railroading, soldering detail bits onto cast brass or cast lead model railroad boilers or locomotives. And you want to talk about a heat sink, pulling the heat away, that's it. Fortunately, I had a pretty good teacher at the time. Chap was a dental technician, and he was a real expert, and he taught me a number of things. One of the things I will agree with, and I'll take a little bit further than Chris did, is what you need for an iron. I mean, this is the smallest one that I use, and this is a 75-watt Hako. I've got one around somewhere. I can't lay my hands on it at the moment. That's about the size of a policeman's trunk. That's a 200-watt iron. And I will take that out when I'm soldering a piece of, let's say, 1/16 of an inch brass. I do have another, a collection of other bits up to and including my favorite toy, which is a resistance soldering outfit. I picked it up on eBay. They are not cheap, but they will do things you cannot do with anything else, because this little outfit will put 800 watts into a small space. And if you want to see something melt quickly, all you do is hit that. Plus the fact that using a carbon electrode means that you can hold the piece in place with the tip, hit the foot switch, which is what I use. It heats up, then take your foot off the switch, It cools down. It won't. The carbon electrode won't stick, and you can hold it in place with that until it cools down. Use a torch from time to time. Usually a pencil type propane torch. It works pretty well. On soldering motors in, this is an example of a soldered in motor. I use this approach mostly when I'm building a sidewinder, which is my favorite configuration. I'm trying to fit it into a relatively narrow space, so I cannot afford the luxury of having any sort of a mount around it. This is an option which is available to us by way of today's technology. Back in the day, the old Pitman motors and the like, with their Alnico magnets and heavy pole pieces, if you tried to get enough heat into them to solder them in, you would completely destroy the magnet. On solder, my favorite solder for most purposes is called TIX, T-I-X. It's a relatively low melting point, but high strength, the solder that comes in very small sticks. It's useful because you can heat up the joint and then using the stick, just sort of run the solder along the joint and watch it form a very neat fillet. I often use it with a different flux. TIX makes their own flux, but I like the Stay Bright flux. What that brings to it, the game, is a somewhat more aggressive acid flux, and I find using that I can solder stainless steel, which is probably these days my favorite chassis building material, very readily. I use a spring-tempered stainless steel for main rails and sheet stainless steel for the end bits. Beyond that, the only comment I want to make, again, reinforcing Chris's comment, is that I look at, shall we say, less than cosmetically appealing solder joints in pictures on the web. Almost invariably, I have to say that the result of a blobby or uneven solder joint simply tells me there wasn't enough heat applied.
Excellent.
My 2 cents.
Thank you very much.
Alan, can I ask a question about the 800 watt with the carbon tip? That sounds almost like a spot welder.
It comes close. Actually, I have never used the full 800 watts, but I don't have the pictures around handy. But I have used it to solder up, let's say, some machined brass rear brackets that were machined out of 64 thousandths brass, which presents a pretty good challenge to typical soldering. And the nice part about that is what you do is just hold the electrode along one side of the joint and apply this stick solder or whatever you have on the other side of the joint. And what you will see is the very satisfying result of having the solder melt opposite where you have the heat, and watch it actually flow through and appear as a very thin line where you're really applying the heat. For those applications, I'm probably using the equivalent of about a 200 to 250 watt iron, but I'm moving it very quickly.
So if you really crank this thing up, you could almost like fuse the brass to itself.
It's possible. I haven't really tried that.
That's a lot of heat. Maybe you could give it a try. Dennis, you've been nodding quite a bit. Do you want to throw anything in or just confirm some of the things they've said or put in some?
A lot of what they've said is absolutely correct and absolutely true. There are a couple of things to add. Number one, Chris was talking about making sure that all the parts are clean, but if your iron isn't clean, you're also in trouble. Heat transfer is the big deal here. The reason that you use a big tip is because those big tips can hold a lot of heat and you transfer the heat very quickly. The wattage of the iron really basically tells you how fast you're going to be able to heat it up again. to make the next joint, or how fast you're going to be able to flow the heat into a joint if there's a lot of sinking. So it's important to have the tip of the iron very clean. Now, most times, people use a little sponge with some water in it, and that's a really terrible way of doing it. That's still okay because I'm getting all kinds of messages on my screen here.
Yeah, people are joining in. You're still good, Dennis. Keep going.
Okay. Those sponges are not a good idea. All of the good soldering tips are metal or ironclad, and if you use the sponges, eventually the thermal shock starts to peel that cladding off the iron. So there's a better stuff to use. I buy mine online from what remains of Hobby Shack, and let's see if you can see that. Or Radio Shack, it's called a tip cleaner, and it looks inside. It looks like this, and you just put the tip of the iron into that, and it's like sal ammoniac or one of those. It just cleans the tip off, and then you wipe it off in some. It looks like a pot scour almost. It's a brass coils that you buy in a little holder from Hacko. So those are the better ways to clean the iron and make sure that the tip is properly tinned, and that, along with using a good amount of flux, as Chris was talking about, gives you good heat transfer into the joint. Alan was talking about feeding the solder in. Now, it does help to have a little bit of solder on the tip, but it's not good soldering practice to transfer all the solder for the joint on the tip of the iron. The only time that I put solder onto the tip of the iron and then try to make a joint is if I'm just trying to tack something in place before I do a full joint. What I use is a solder wire that is, this is 15 thousandths diameter, so it's very, very thin. This one that I get from Radio Shack is a 2% silver, so it has 62% lead, 62% tin, 36% lead, and 2% silver. So it's a little stronger than a plain 60/40 solder, which is what I use for electrical stuff. The extra silver helps there. When I'm building 1/24 scale retro cars, I tend to use different solders in different places. On most of the structural joints, where I mount the motor bracket, for example, I'll use Stay-Bright solder, which has 4% silver. That's a good deal stronger. But what we found over the years is the type of solder that you use, particularly when you're soldering rails together or the chassis together, is it makes a difference to how the chassis handles. And a chassis that's built completely with 60/40, brass and piano wire chassis, the way that handles the first time you put it on the track is pretty much the way it's going to be. If you use the Stay-Bright or high silver content, the handling changes a little bit over time. As the chassis gets used, it tends to settle a little. So they tend to get a little better the second and third time you use them, and then they stabilize. But a 60/40 chassis, the way it is when you build it, that's probably basically the best it's going to get. Other than that, not a lot to say. I think, Greg, your original question was, how do you control how much solder there is in the joint? Well, I've had people ask me that. What do you use to clean off the excess solder on your chassis? The real answer is don't put it there in the first place, right? Use just a little on the tip to make sure that you get a good heat transfer, and then try to heat up the metal far enough that it flows the solder into the joint, and then apply the solder as you go, so you don't get too much. And it does happen that you get too much, and there are a number of ways to get it off. But see, Alan's picking up his sidewinder. Let's hear what he has to say.
Yeah, I would agree. I would have, one thing I forgot, and Dennis mentioned that the business of carrying solder to the work on the tip of the iron. I do that under one circumstance and one circumstance only. For joints that I want to get in particularly quickly in and out of, like this one, because I still, hangover from the old days, I really don't like heating motors up. I will tin the surface first and do that by applying a bit of flux, trying to restrict it to the area that I'm going to solder to, and then with just a bit of solder on the iron, a quick swipe across the surface to leave a very thin layer of solder there, so that when you come to melt the two pieces together, you're actually melting solder to solder, and it's rather like using a towel to soak up water. It tends to suck things in very nicely.
Or contact cement. You get the two pieces cemented and then you stick them together.
Exactly, yeah. Well, that takes you onto the whole area of what is called sweat soldering, where typically used to attach a couple of relatively large surfaces together, as for example, soldering a guide bracket onto the front of a metal chassis where you're overlapping, let's say perhaps at least a 3/16 of an inch. That's simple enough to do. You simply, all you have to do in that case is tin the two together and hold them down long enough with a hot iron to see the edge melt a little bit, and they're together forever.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your expertise on that. Did anybody else have any questions for our chassis building experts that they want to have addressed? Or
while Alan was talking about sweating it on, I got up and found a chassis that I'm busy building. And you can see there the front end of the chassis has this steel guide tongue that's mounted, that's soldered directly onto a piece of brass. Now, what I do there is I take the guide tongue, I flux it, and I pre-tin the surface. Then I put it on in the jig, I put it on there, and then I heat that whole area up with a torch, and that will melt the solder and have it completely covered underneath there with absolutely nothing showing out along the edges of it. So that's the sweating that he's talking about. But very important there, and a really nice way, if you're soldering motors in, to pre-solder the motor or pre-tin the motor and then clean it so that you don't have any acid flux left. And then if you pre-tin the brass or the piano wire where the motor is going to be soldered, then you can use a little bit of rosin paste flux and just remelt those two joints to solder the motor in. And then you don't have all that. You don't have any extra acid in and around the motor and the chassis when that's done. The rosin flux you can clean off with some denatured alcohol or some isopropyl alcohol or something like that. But the acid flux, of course, you probably need to wash it. Don't be scared of washing motors, of course, as long as you let them dry out properly.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask about. One is how often, Dennis, do you use a torch versus your iron? Because I asked Chris kind of the same question. And number two is washing the motor. Yeah, that's always a bit of a worrisome thing.
The only time you have a problem with washing the motor is if you don't want the labels to come off. No, really, I mean, wash the motor out, right? Just make sure that it's dry before you use it. Right? But I mean, even then, you don't even have to worry that much. We break in motors underwater in 1/24 scale racing.
Sorry, say that again. You break in motors underwater. So you have electrical.
Yeah.
You run them underwater?
Correct. Correct. When you're racing retro racing, particularly.
Sorry, isn't that against the Geneva Convention?
No. Running slot cars on less than on anything other than 12 volts is against the Geneva Convention. But yeah,
Dennis,
and
We need
the
to make the
fundamental
point
laws
that
of
you
nature.
need to
of
use
course.
deionized water for that.
yeah, and do you put a drop of isopropyl or something in with it?
I don't. I use water straight out of the tap. I don't bother with any of these other crazy ideas. And really, all you do is you put some water in a cup or a glass, hook the motor up to a power supply switched off, but preset to about 3 volts, and then I'll drop the motor into the water. And once it's in and fully full of water, then I'll switch the power supply on, and I'll run on the Falcon or the Eagle or the Retro Hawk motors that we run in retro. I'll run them for about 15 seconds or so underwater, and then I'll check the brushes and see how far they've gone. You shine a little torch into them, and then you go and try it again. And never really need more than about a minute, and then you'll find the brushes are nicely seated against the commutator. Sometimes a little bit more.
So once it's in the water, do you put alcohol on it or anything, or do you just leave it?
How do you mean? Once it comes out the water?
Yeah.
When it comes out the water, I'll shake it off and have a look at it. And if it's not done, then I'll dip it in and carry on. If it's good, then I'll blow it out with some compressed air and re-oil the bushings and put it in the car.
Okay. So you do use compressed air to blow the water out then?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Thank you.
Running motor.
I'm sorry, Leo. I'll get to you just a sec. The question I had might be Leo's question. Do you ever reuse parts like Alan with his, axle carriers, soldered to the motor housing? Do you ever reuse parts by desoldering them from one another? And then, if so, and I kind of assume that you do, what do you do to clean those surfaces? Do you just kind of make sure there's no residual flux, or do you try to take off any residual solder too?
Depends how much solder is on there. But for example, sometimes I'll have an axle tube at the front end of a chassis that's taking the front axle, and I'll take it out. Usually, you can, if your iron is clean, you can melt whatever solder is there, and if the flow with the iron, you can basically give the tube a shake, and it'll throw some of the molten solder off.
Sorry to interject, guys. We're having a thunderstorm here, so if I cut out, please don't take it personally.
We'll try. And then I'll often just file off excess solder if there's a lot of it. Like if I'm restoring an old car that some guy tried to paste together with blobs of under-melted solder in the 60s, and somebody, for whatever crazy reason, wants it restored, I'll very often just do that. And I'll use a big rough file, and I'll file off the majority of the solder. And then I'll use those little, it's a little Dremel abrasive disc that has like those little fibers on them. Yeah. I'll use those to clean off the last of it. But then I use that on my chassis to clean the chassis as well. You know those little abrasive discs I'm talking about.
Leo, did you have a question?
Yeah, coming back to the running motors in underwater. Am I right in thinking that's all about preventing arcing at the brushes on the commutator?
Sorry.
The biggest deal about that, Leo, is breaking them in quickly. This whole thing of breaking them in underwater started with the radio-controlled car guys many years back, where they were being issued motors at the beginning of a race day, and they wanted to break them in as quick as they could. And so by putting them in water, the first thing that happens is, as you run the motor, there's a lot more rotational resistance. So the motor is drawing a lot more current, and that breaks the brushes in quicker. There's much more current flowing through the current brushes into the commutator. It also keeps the commutator cool, stops the arcing as you're talking about, but it also washes away any of the extra little brush dust that might be there. But effectively, it's really to get it done very quickly. And when we're running retro cars and we have a handout motor race, you're allowed to buy maybe up to 3 motors, and you want to try them all, but you've only got an hour or 2 hours worth of practice before the race starts. So you want to get them done as quick as you can, and that's the way you do it.
Yeah. In slot cars, we probably started doing motor break-ins mid-70s, I guess. When we're talking, these are all much more sophisticated motors than the motors most of us run today in the 32nd scale cars. And from our point, it was not so much to break the bushings in, because the motors are all built with alignment jigs, and the jigs, the motor bushes, the motor bearings were all fairly well aligned. It was using the water to reduce arcing when you were spinning it around, because anytime there is arcing, the arcing pits the com. And in a perfect world, you want a perfectly smooth motor brush face, and you want a perfectly smooth com. That's why the higher end motors, we all have tire truers for our 32nd scale cars. Most of the 24 scale cars have com truers to cut the coms. I have read a lot about using lemon juice or, earwax from a whale or honey or all kinds of stuff. And I can tell you right now, if you just use plain old tap water, that's probably the best thing to do. And the higher end motors all have very comparatively soft motor brushes. So when Dennis said, 15 or 20 seconds, that's all you need. Any more than that, and you will take a considerable amount of brush meat off of the brush. For more modern motors, all the motors that we run today, or most of you guys run, they're not bloody well designed as slot car motors. They're electric toothbrush motors and whatever little thing, and they're designed to run for 100,000 years, which they do very well. So the brushes in them are really, really hard on a comparative basis. So if you were breaking in, your basic scale electrics Mabuchi motor, I don't advise breaking in motors that don't have little holes somewhere in the can. If it's a completely sealed can, it's a little more tricky. You can run those for an hour, 2 hours, because the brushes are so hard. And again, everybody says, well, I ran it at 3 volts for 10 minutes and 6 volts and then 12 volts for. That is completely defeating the purpose of breaking in a motor, because you want them in a perfect world. To break in a motor, you would not even use electricity. You would hook up a Dremel shaft, a flexible Dremel shaft, and mechanically let that spin the armature shaft. Now you're introducing no electricity into the motor, and there is zero potential for any arcing, which is the big problem in the motor. So if you want to break in your motors, knock yourself out. There's 2 schools of thought, or is it really better? Is it really worse? If you want to invent some new potion of a bit of vermouth and a bit of rye and whatever you want to think you want to put in there, go ahead. It's not going to make a bloody bit of difference.
Yeah, Chris, one of the things we do in our club is we run slotted and NSR motors, pretty normal stuff, is we give them a quick dip to blow the crap out halfway through the season.
Yeah, no. I mean, there is a certain amount of brush material and or debris off the track and or oil. I find that most newer 32nd scale racers tend to over oil their motors a little bit too much. So yes, you can get that stuff in there. And if you do get a buildup of any material in the slots between the commutator segments, that can cause shorting and that can cause all kinds of crap. So, in between, every couple of races, if you just get a squirt of contact cleaner and shoot it in there, that's going to clean out the slots between the comp. You can't make a motor go faster than it's designed to go. It's got a certain magnetic Gauss, and then the wind, the number of turns, the thickness of the wire is going to dictate potentially how fast that motor can ever possibly go. It's not going any faster than that. So you read about guys with a 10,000 RPM motor that gave it a magic shot of sauce, and all of a sudden it's a 25,000 RPM motor. It's not quite right. But I mean, contact cleaner, a quick shot to clean out the comp, great idea.
I guess it's like those pills they advertise on the internet.
Well, it's like a lot of stuff. Somebody tried something and it had some sort of a reaction some way. So, all blue slot cars are faster than green slot. Like it's the same sort of thing, right?
Excellent.
Thanks, guys.
Love the expertise going around here. Does anybody else have any chassis related things? Andy, go ahead.
Well, it's not chassis; it's motor. We had running in motors is a black science. It's one of these things that at our club, it's like many things that men do when they're alone. Nobody wants to talk about it, but they do it. And there was one guy at our club we were racing, and we race mostly the 13D. I think they're also called short canter Mabuchi motors in most of our classes. And I think I mentioned it in a previous call, every lane has its own laboratory power supply. And that thing, you can see amps, anything electrical you can see on it. And this one guy's motor was always pulling 1 amp more than everybody else's.
There was a lot of, we ran the 24 scale worlds for all the playfit and Scholler type chassis in Toronto in 2009. And prior to that, we'd all been using, the standard motor back then was the Fox 10 for all that kind of stuff. In 2009, we approached Dan DeBella to come up with the PS4000s, which that motor, because a lot of guys were actually crushing the cans on the side of the motor, which you had to, it didn't always work, because anytime you pinch the side of the can on the, and I'm talking the outside of the magnets, not the top of the bottom of the can, side of the cans. So if you can crush the can a little bit without any deflection, either on the end bell end or on the can end, the brush end, you can get the magnets a tiny bit closer to the armature, improving a little bit of torque, which is, you're running 200-gram cars on a Fox 10. They're pretty anemic little buggers. So anytime you can get a little more torque, you can do that. More torque will show up on an amp meter as drawing more amps. So without, I would, not a nice word, but I'll use the cheater word on that one. And it was pretty commonplace back then. In higher forms of racing, you don't have to do that much, because the magnets are god awfully strong with Neos and Cobalts and all the rest of the stuff. But the Fox motor, there was a lot of guys dicking around with trying to crush the cans.
Andy, that guy whose car drew 1 amp more than everybody else's, was he the quickest? Was the car the quickest?
Yes, he was. He had won that series pretty much all season, and then the guy who does race control can see all of the power supplies, and after a race where I think the next guy wasn't even. I remember the number 10. I can't remember if he was 10 laps ahead or if he was 10 seconds ahead of the next person. And he said, "Let me see that motor." But we couldn't physically see anything. If he crushed it, he must have done it in such a way that. Now this is a guy who actually has his own model shop. So my guess is he literally tested every single motor he had till and he probably has something like that at home, and he tested it till he found the absolute best motor to do that, which may have just been out of tolerances.
I would say then that Chris's assessment is probably very close to what was actually happening.
Sorry, Andy, what kind of motor, like what, these were like your 13D, what you guys call a 13D motor, like a Fox 10 type thing?
Yeah, it was a Fox equivalent or a Fox motor, probably a Fox motor, because that's a series that's been around for a while. There's a guy here in Germany who gets the Fox motor from the same factory where they were made. He just is not allowed to call them Fox motors, and we're allowed to.
No. Okay, yeah. Those things draw so little amperage, to be honest with you. You could test 1,000 of them and you're not going to find an amp. Like an amp difference for a motor to draw is out of 1,000 motors coming out of a tray, out of a set armature wind and a set, they all have basically within a degree or two the same commutator advance. And a degree or two in a commutator advance is like sweet bugger all. That's not going to do, no one's going to do that. So if it was a sealed can, one of two things can happen. He could have found a really smart way to take the end bell off and replace the armature, or, but that's fairly easy to see. Crushing the can is more difficult, and you don't really, because magnetism works in, you don't have to crush it a mile before the magnetism increases. The last thing he could have done to draw more amps is be a crappy builder and have the axles all bound up and the gear mesh all wrong, but then he's not going to win by 10 miles.
Correct. The other thing he possibly could have been doing is to tweak the advance of the commutator with some dental floss.
There is another possibility.
Those Fox motors, Dennis, there's no can, that's a completely sealed can.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, you can't get at it.
Did say he ran the motor in. That's why when you guys started talking about it and people were asking him what's his secret juice, and he said something with like WD-40 and water, and I think it was distilled water or deionized water and all this kind of stuff. And I think he also did it for 10 hours or something like that. Maybe that's where I remember the 10 from.
What were you thinking, Alan? Oh, you accidentally muted yourself somehow.
All right. There's another possibility that occurs to me, and the thought expands across a couple of things we talked about. Obviously, if you put in a taller gear, you're going to load the motor up more, and it will draw more current. Other thing to consider: if you squeeze the can, push the magnets a bit closer together. Yeah, that will up the magnetic field. Magnetic field, by the way, is a square function of distance, so it doesn't take much to move it up. The consequence of that, incidentally, if you go into, start playing with the motor theory and so forth, yeah, you can crank up the magnetic field, you'll get more torque, but you're also going to lose RPM at the top end. I would like to jump back just quickly to the cleaning part and the break end. On cleaning after soldering, one of the things I do, I keep a small cup on my bench with a 50-50 mix of household ammonia and water. And when I've finished the solder joint, I just dip a little brush into that and brush the solder joint with it. That pretty well takes care of any acid flux. The final cleanup is done in one of my most used tools in slot car building, and that is a small ultrasonic cleaner. And you can dump the chassis into this, again, with this 50-50 ammonia water mix, and let it sit for about, and vibrate for about 15 minutes, and rinse it off, and you have certainly gotten all of the flux off it.
Alan, sorry, when you say ammonia, do you mean like Windex or pure ammonia or?
Yeah, household ammonia, you know, the plastic jug you get in the grocery store.
Oh,
Probably don't want to leave the brass in there too long because I know that'll
Yeah,
cause.
no, you don't want to leave it too long. You can take it out and then polish up the brass. I like my chassis to look nice. The chassis is what I like to do most. And the ultrasonic cleaner is very good for that. On break-in, I don't break in motors in water. My break-in routine is to get the chassis to the point where the motor, gear, rear axle are assembled, put a couple of wheels and tires on for a little added resistance, set it up in a vise and run it again at a low voltage for however long it takes me to get on with something else and then come back to it. The object being to bed the brushes a little bit and also get the, smooth out any minor irregularities in the gears and polish up the bushings a little bit.
All right. Does anybody else have any other commentary, questions on chassis soldering and or motor running in?
Yeah, just one quick thing for Andy. That wasn't universally the North America. The 2009 Worlds had, we had all the Nick DeVochters and Tamar Newlands and everybody in Canada for that, the Van Rossums, Chris Radisich, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those guys, including the guys here and the Italians and the Czechs and everyone else, was very, very familiar with can crushing. So it is not it's not something that, rarely happens.
Okay. Well, we started handing out motors at the beginning of races not long after that.
Probably a wise idea. And hand out the motors without pliers.
Yeah. We actually have a gauge in Southern California for the retro racing. At the big races, we have a gauge that measures the diameter across the rounded areas of the motor to ensure that nobody has done that. Part of the technical checks before we race.
Well, I certainly learned something new today, and that'll be interesting to kind of, measure people's cans. What did you want to say, Alan?
One last comment on motors. I got back into slot car racing probably about 95 when I got back in really seriously. And on one of the old DLs, they called them, I found a guy who was up in Buffalo who apparently had gone into it gung-ho and then decided either he needed the money or he wanted to get out of it or whatever. I bought literally a car full of track, cars, bits and pieces from him. He drove down to Buffalo and unloaded it all. It was all Scalextric stuff, and I ended up with about 30 Scalextric motors. Well, I'm a numbers guy, scientist by training. And it didn't take me long to set up those motors on a simple little jig with a calibrated power supply and a little painted propeller disc and an optical tachometer. And I went through them. And this was, out of the box, untouched, about 30 Scalextric motors. I found about a plus or minus 15% variation in speed and current draw across the lot. So these motors have tight tolerances where it counts, tolerances a little bit looser where it doesn't make any difference. I mean, how, can you really tell how fast your electric toothbrush is running?
Yeah. Well, when you order motors from either Mabuchi or Sun, which are the two big producers of the toy tin can motors we use today, right on their website, they stand by a plus or minus 10% variation in terms of actually RPM of the whole thing. So, and they cost pennies to buy these motors. I know that we bought a bunch of Falcon motors years ago, a few years ago, And they were 25 cents each to get the Falcon motors, and that's a 50,000 RPM motor Eskia. So, you know, for the they're all computer done and robot done, so you know they are fairly close to manufacturer spec. The issue is not every one of them has a perfectly straight armature shaft, and not every magnet goes in perfectly well, and not every magnet has the same Gauss as the other one, and the bearings can be a bit out of line and stuff like this. So all that said, there can be a good difference in motors. All that said, I'm amazed they're as consistent, you know, for 25 cents as they are. So, and at the end of the day, the last thing I think for most racers on most home circuits and most club racing, the least important thing in car setup is how fast my motor is. That's the last thing I think most guys should worry about.
But it's always the first thing everyone complains about.
It must be my motor.
Oh yeah. The thing about it too, in some situations where, and this happens a lot in 1/24 scale retro, the track is too fast for the car, which means that everybody is chasing the last tenth of a second, and everybody is chasing the motor that has 1% better performance. So, you know, if people were to run on tracks that were more difficult or required less horsepower, nobody would complain about motors because the motor wouldn't be the most important thing. But when you're running a retro car on a wing car track, you know, the difference between a 3.8 second lap and a 3.9 second lap is mostly in the motor, not anywhere else. And because it's how fast the thing can get down the straightaway. So yeah, it's a problem that exists in some other areas. Fortunately, most of 1/32 scale, we're not in that situation. Our tracks are not faster than our cars.
But people still think that they need a faster motor.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Put them on a tiny little technical track where they wouldn't need anything more than a 10K motor to begin with, and they're all wanting to put 50K motors in there because they think that'll make them better.
And I did this at one stage on my track. Is I've always been one of those guys who said slot cars run on 12 volts. I turned the voltage down to 10.5. Everybody went faster in individual lap times and faster in overall lap totals. And that just proved the point.
Wonderful. I love it. Before we move on, I see we have a couple of our returning guests, but I don't know that Kevin has been on before. Kevin, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself? There you go.
Yeah, I've just started back in the hobby really, so I'm just listening to you guys and just seeing what the crack is really.
Well, I hear an accent. Whereabouts are you from?
From northwest England.
Cool. Well, I'm sure there's somebody on here in your area that can point you in the right direction if you ever have any questions. Or
I'm about 4 miles from Pendle.
Well, spoiled. Well, thank you for joining us, Kevin. Hopefully you can join us in the future. Let me see if I have any other topics to hit on. Nope, not really. Anybody have anything they want to bring up or show off or questions? Wayne, did you want to show us something cool? You're muted.
Yep. Just off last week's one when I was listening in afterwards, we're talking about memorabilia, and I think someone was talking about Can-Am cars, and he was talking to Carol Shelby. Oh, my phone's gone. I have a friend of mine who was in the States for about 20 years, totally unrelated. He's a quarter horse guy. But him and his brother were doing some work with Carroll Shelby when he was getting his new Shelby. He gave him the Goodyear race jacket, and it's signed by Carroll Shelby. And he gave that to me and said, "Oh, you're interested in car stuff? Here you go." So I have a Goodyear race jacket in Australia signed by Carroll Shelby. And he also gave me a 18th scale model of that, you know, the newer shaped Mustang thing he was working on, which is up in my shed, which I'll bring next time. But yeah, so it was quite interesting. I was like, "You really know him?" And then, of course, they came out with the Shelby thing from the Le Mans that was on Netflix, and the Shelby story. And I was talking, he goes, "Oh, yeah, I know all the guy, the mechanic bloke and all them." "Oh, yeah." Okay. So he was all casual about that. And I thought, oh, my God. So it's quite amazing that ends up in Australia now.
That's pretty.
Anyway, and yeah, I'm going to have to leave you guys. I have to go to work. So.
All right. Well, enjoy your day.
Unfortunately. Thank you very much, and enjoying we hope to keep this going because it's good fun. And yeah.
All right. Thanks, Wayne. Have a good day.
No worries, guys. Enjoy the rest of the meeting, and I'll hopefully catch you next week.
Be good.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
All right. Does anybody have any other show and tell? Wayne just upped the ante with his Carroll Shelby jacket. Does anybody want to show anything off or ask?
I've got something that's a bit of a Slucker oddity, but it definitely cannot hold the candle to Carroll Shelby's coat from 1960 or whatever. Here in Germany, you know, Carrera is the biggest brand, and most people know the Evolution and the Exclusive, and they know the Carrera Go, which is 143rd. But what a lot of people don't know is they actually, from 1984 to 2006, they made a series called Profi, which is German slang for professional, and this is a system that, like I said, it was in production for a very long time. Yeah, so they're 18 centimeters wide. So just for comparison, here's some sport track. You can sort of see it's a little bit wider than the sports track. The slot width is just a tad smaller. Officially, it was called a 1/40th scale, which is also very, very odd. As far as I know, I don't know of any other brand that made a 1/40th scale. There's 1/43rd, 1/32nd, stuff like that. You can very easily race 1/32 on there. Well, but probably the most interesting about it is in 1984 they introduced that, and then in 1985 they brought in a new guy by the name of Kurt Hess to take over Carrera. And the guy who actually founded Carrera, unfortunately, couldn't take the fact that his baby was gone and committed suicide in 1985. Now, Kurt Hess ran Carrera for only about 2 years, I think. And then all of a sudden, this company called Cartronic showed up. And when you look at Cartronic and you look at Carrera Profi and you put them together, they're practically the exact same size. And they're almost exact same slot width. It's probably not going to come across on the camera very well. But there's like a millimeter difference. And then about the same time, once Kurt Hess got taken off, all of a sudden, this product started showing up on the market, and that's does it just say it in German? Yeah, so it says these are adapter pieces. I think it says it on the side in English, which has the Cartronic on one side and the Profi on the other, and you can combine the two. And you know, it's just a little, and this Cartronic track and both the Profi was sold in a cheaper version where they essentially just cut off the red borders. Those you definitely could not race 1/32 on those, but they're perfect for 1/40th or 1/43rd. Only analog only. Both systems had 2 curve radii. Excuse me. I had Latin at one point in school. Both flat and banked curves. So I've actually recreated the Daytona Oval with it. And the radii are a little bit different of both the brands, so that's why a lot of people get these adapter pieces, because it just makes it a little bit more interesting. And one of the most exciting things about this is when you do these in 4-lane, the two inside lanes are actually further apart than the standard evolution or exclusive track for Carrera. So what a lot of guys do is they use this as 2-lane or 4-lane for the smaller cars, but then they'll put the 124s on the two inside lanes and use that, so you only need the one system to basically race any scale you want. And that's just one little these really weird anecdotal little things, and it's closely tied to Carrera history. Cartronic still exists. They make a 124 scale track that's directly, you can plug it right into Carrera track now. I don't have any of that stuff because I've got tons of this stuff, so I don't need it. And they also make, but they don't make they make 143rd scale. And I think it's essentially the same, and it's fortunate Lloyd's not on because he would know this probably. I think it's the same as Arton track or, and I think Arton track is kind of like SCX. I mean, they're exact same measurements, just the connector's a little bit different. So all you have to do is cut them in the middle to make adapters. So they're still around. The cars for Cartronic, they're more on the line of Fly. You know, they look pretty good they don't look as good as Fly cars, but they don't race quite as good. Yeah, I mean, it's probably not much of interest for anybody who's not in continental Europe as far as getting it. But I just thought the timing of everything, you know, this was introduced in 1984. You know, this guy quits the company, basically makes it completely. He copies the system, takes the system with him, and then just by chance, these adapter pieces show up on the German market out of the blue. And they don't say anywhere on the packaging that what systems they're compatible to. It just says here, you know, you've got the one system here, and then you've got the other system over here, and that's all it says. And this stuff is readily available here in Germany, really, really easy to get hold of. And like I said, because you can, by making 4-lane, you can race absolutely any scale on it. It's kind of a neat little thing. And yeah, that's just, like I said, just a little Slot Car oddity. Oh yeah, the cars. Here's the Profi Car though. The Profi Cars are 1/40th scale. This is my favorite car because I'm a huge transaxle fan. This is of course a 924 turbo, not a 944. This one has had a lot of love, as some people would say. The glass is coming out. This particular one has no interior. There was a 1/40th scale servo brand where the cars could actually change lanes. It wasn't digital, and those actually had interiors. But I think the most interesting thing about it is, massive amounts of magnets, and it's a 4 screws to hold the body on. And these chassis are really, really sought after because they're indestructible. They're plastic, but they almost feel like fiberglass. They're really, really stiff. Here's a Porsche 956. And as you can see, the chassis are essentially the same. The wheel sizes are practically the same. You know, so as far as a model is concerned, it's not the world's best model. You know, when you look at it, it doesn't even have real headlights. These were the go-to cars in the late 80s, early 90s here in Germany, and they actually, you know, I've never raced the magless. I've only ever raced these with the magnets, but with the magnets. You know, especially because a 924 is a fairly rare car to see as a slot car. I think Falcon's the only other ones who made them a 1/32nd scale. There was a German brand called Gamma. They had a system, and the weird thing about that is the cars actually latched into the slot. You could not de-slot with them. They made a 924, but it basically looked like a 924 that somebody had like hooked up to an air compressor and blew it up. It was totally out of proportion. It's a really ugly car. But of course I have one because I'm transaxle fan. But yeah, like I said, it's probably not a massive amount of interest for people on the call, but I thought, you know, this is something weird. I actually wanted to do a thing about borders, but I couldn't get all my borders together. I have too many.
Well, Lloyd is here. Lloyd, do you know what he's talking about with the 43rd stuff?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't see you there.
Yeah, I'm hiding. The Cartronic is something that we haven't seen over here in England. It crops up on a lot of the Facebook groups, and I hear people in Germany talking about it, but I've not seen it before, so it's interesting to see it there. But when you held it up, it looked very big to me, but you say it's 1/40th.
Cartronic sold their system as 1/32nd scale, and the slot spacing is a little bit bigger than the Profi. So it's like, but only about, it's, let me just see, measure it real quick here. So the Cartronic slot is, from the middle of the slot to the other middle slot is exactly 7.5 centimeters, whereas the Profi is just about 7.25. So yeah, it was primarily sold as a 1/32 scale system, but they only sell 1/43 and 1/24 now.
Oh, right. Yeah, I haven't seen the 1/43 lately. You mentioned about other 1/40th scale. Juef in France have been, for many, many years, they did 1/40th, and they were good little cars with steering and everything. And there's a great following of those on the continent, particularly in France. Here we have, I don't have much to do with the ready-to-run cars, so I don't follow that side of it too much. But you've got Kevin on there, and I've got one of Kevin's cars here.
Oh, so
What
you're
is-
as you thought, huh, Kevin? Trying to escape.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, one of Kevin's work. But Kevin sent it to me when it was still wet paint, and so the bubble wrap has rather distorted the paint a little bit. But the car runs beautifully.
Okay, so you're still pretty new.
No, it's I don't know whether you can see it from here, but it's actually a really nice job on a simple R10 car. I'll get it up there a little bit. Nice bit of work turned it into a rally car there. So I'm pleased to see it, and we're looking forward to when the event happens. And Kevin's two cars should do just as well. Should do pretty well on there. I've got nothing much to say today, apart from I've been to the dentist and had a tooth took out.
Well, we won't make you speak then. I understand that. that one. That car did look pretty good. I made it focus on the screen, so good job.
He's done a nice job on it.
Yeah.
For somebody who doesn't do 1/43, it's nice to see some new people in.
Very cool.
I'm gone. I'm muting now. There we go.
Give your teeth a rest. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to show and tell? Or Leo, did you have something? You're muted.
I'm still muted? No.
There you go.
A question for Andy, please. The Carrera servo track, is that the same as Carrera Profi track?
No. The servo had no slot, and there was a 1/32 scale and a 1/40th scale for sure. I don't think there was a 1/24 scale. The radii of the curves for Profi were the same as the universal, which was the first official 1/32 scale track that they brought out after they'd had an exclusive for quite some time. So like what some Profi people, especially if they race 1/24, they will add those borders from the universal track because it fits. Yeah, the servo thing, basically the cars, I mean, this Porsche here also was available as a servo, and they had sticking out of the extremities, they had these, they call them horns. They have these little horns that stuck out, and somehow there were three rails, and then the blades, or excuse me, the braids on the bottom were actually metal shoes, and they always had like a little, they were sort of like dog leg shaped, and so you physically would switch them around to make them run on a different different track. So like you would have the legs splayed, or you'd have them off to this way or off to this way, or they would be both pointing in the middle. So you could get, I don't know how many cars. I've never played with the servo system. I just, because I wanted the 924 and I kept seeing them with this weird horn sticking out. So I found out about the servo system because of that. And the controllers had a steering wheel on them, so that you would turn left and right and you go, but there were only, just like on red digital tracks today, there were only certain spots where you could do that. So I'm guessing there was something in the track to allow that to happen. So it was a very early version of that.
Yeah, I remember now the servo track had a wall down the side, didn't it? Each had a wall that the horns presumably rubbed against or something.
Yeah, and of course there's a huge, for years before the 3D printing and stuff, those horns of course broke off all the time, and people were paying up to €2 or €3 just for one little piece of plastic, because without it the car doesn't work. And yeah, there's a lot of people who lament that. A lot of people lament the universal system had a slot, but in the bottom of the slot was where the negative was. And so both sides of the slot were positive, and then you would reset your shoes to race two cars in the same slot. How they got around each other, I don't know. But there's a guy who sells conversion kits to convert regular slot cars to quote unquote universal. So if you ever buy a car over the internet from Germany and it says universal, like it's a electric car and it says universal on it, he's probably converted it to the universal system, which means it won't work on. You have to put back the old system in there.
Yeah. And Andy, that sounds a little bit like TCM.
Yeah, TCM or TCR?
TCR, sorry. TCR.
Yeah, I remember that was out when I was a kid. I started with a Tyco track, and I remember the idea of being able to switch lanes and stuff always fascinated me. Yeah, in fact, at the place where I take my electronic stuff for recycling, somebody had thrown away a servo track. Unfortunately, my wife was with me, so when I pulled out the track out of the bin, she gave me the look of "Don't you dare." So I've never played with it, but the servo stuff, yeah. There's the universal system, the servo system. You know, there's a huge community, especially in the German-speaking countries, around that.
I'm learning all kinds of stuff today. I love it.
That was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm all about this trivial, weird stuff. I've always been for the underdog, and it all kind of really kicked off with the 924, because I had a 924 when I lived in the States, and I think it's a much maligned Porsche. It's a really, really good car, and when I saw that it was made, and then like this car here in its condition that you see it with the split front and the windshield or the glass falling out, it cost me like €25 because they're so rare. They're the 956 is a little more common, and again here you see the glass is sort of falling out. And but I did an article for Slot Car Magazine about Prefo, or Prefo as it was pronounced in German, which is an East German car brand, and that had this huge, especially during the COVID stuff. A lot of people are finding these things and getting them back to work and stuff like that. And it was just by a fluke that I did that article. Mostly because the thing I was supposed to write about, I didn't do the research in time, and that was the only thing I could think of I could write an article about within the deadline. And the second part of that's coming out in their current edition. That is a shameless plug, I will admit. But yeah, all these little things, lots and lots of stuff popping up on the forums, people getting their old tracks out. Oh, it's all rusty. What do I do? But we've talked about all that kind of stuff before.
It's interesting to me, and I'm sure John's sitting over there just sucking up all the information, aren't you, John?
I am, and if it looks like I've changed a tire, it's because we just had a flash thunderstorm here, and one of our window wells filled up right by the track. Luckily, everything's elevated, no damage, everything's fine. I just had to get extremely wet and basically bail out a window well. It's like being on a ship. Exactly. Yeah.
Good thing everything is okay. Does anybody
Yeah, everything's fine, and it shows you what my wife is like. She's actually right now just mopping up under the track to make sure everything's okay.
Awesome. She's a keeper.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Anybody have any topics they'd like to bring up, or should I toss something out for the last 15 minutes? All right. So I have a one-word topic suggestion. So we'll just have to interpret this topic suggestion however we see fit. He said licensing. So I'm sure there are some people who have some opinions on licensing. So I'll let anybody who wants to just chime in on licensing with respect to car bodies, liveries, whatever, just however what is your pet peeve or insider information on licensing? Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, Greg, we brought this up with Maurizio one year at the Henley 24 Hour, and we said, why don't you make Ferraris? Is it a licensing issue? And then he then went on to explain that the licensing, you actually buy the blueprint to the vehicle, and you can do whatever you want with that blueprint. So that really threw me, because I thought you'd say, okay, I want to license the Ferrari brand or the Red Bull brand, and he said, no, we actually have to buy rights to use the blueprint to make a scale model, which is not at all what I expected.
Yeah, that's the last thing I would have expected too. That's the first time I've ever heard that. That's crazy.
Well, next time you get hold of Maurizio, ask him the question: why doesn't he make Ferraris?
Chris, do you have any licensing pet peeves?
Pet peeves on licensing for slot cars. My pet peeve is that there is licensing issues. I mean, it's you would think bringing models of Ferraris or Porsche 924s or Subarus or whatever you can name into the homes of a bunch of little kids and parents would arguably be good for the brand overall. Especially, considering that, the amount of people who buy Ferrari slot car models, if they spend their money on Ferrari slot car models, it's a pretty pale argument to say, well, that subtracts from the money they have left over to buy real Ferraris. So I find it bizarre. I find it particularly bizarre. Quite a few years ago, I got involved with SCX in North America on a couple of issues regarding NASCAR and stuff like that. And the problems they had with drivers and sponsors, and you had to get licensing from GM or Ford, and then you had to get licensing from the main sponsor, then you had to get driver individual licensing. There was 4 licensing scenarios involved in producing a NASCAR. So I understand everybody wants to get the few bucks that they can possibly get, but to be honest with you, the amount of dollars that Chevy or Ford or Ferrari would get from licensing a few slot car models, hopefully, is not going to make or break.
A bit of a perspective on the business side, having worked on the agency side for General Motors and Ford. These guys will tell you it's not the money so much as control. They just want to make sure that their brand isn't misrepresented, that things are the way they are, they're supposed to be. That's the business logic more than the money. But listen, they'll take the money.
Well, it's also in marketing. It's always great to have excuses to hide the real answer, right? So
yeah, the same thing happened in the NHL in '95 when when the NHL found out how much hockey players were making on hockey cards, and all of a sudden it was part of the CBA.
Right.
What's CBA mean?
Oh, collective bargaining agreement.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry.
That's the perspective that I kind of assumed is, Ferrari doesn't want some toy manufacturer making a piece of junk that then people will associate, oh, well, this toy's a piece of junk, Ferrari's a piece of junk, whatever. I don't think there's a whole lot of reality to that. They'll say this is a piece of junk toy, but a real Ferrari is awesome and I still want a real Ferrari. But I'm definitely with Chris on they're probably not making enough money to be worth it, and they're losing out on a lot of basically name brand recognition and advertising by making it harder for their products to be in the home, in a home that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford a real Ferrari.
Yeah, and you'll never get a client to agree, but there's always an upward spiral with merch. One of the first people to really realize that was the chap who created The Simpsons, Matt Groening. He actually promoted pirate articles and T-shirts and stuff to help to promote his show.
There's a video. There's a video. I can't remember which channel it is. I'll have to dig it out and link. But it's Adrian he used to work at Hornby. Norman.
Yeah, Norman.
Yeah, Adrian Norman did a speech at Gaydon, must have been 2014 or maybe even 2012, because I think unfortunately he was let go, I think in 2016 or something like that, where he explained how the whole licensing thing works. And the quality's not great. You have to really listen hard because he was speaking through a PA system, whatever. But he was talking about McLaren, and I think it was the P1. And it was something, I don't think he actually spoke in money numbers, but it was something like they basically had to give them the money for, I think it was 20,000 units, but even before they had started making the car. Like they'd worked out how much they would get per car, which wouldn't be much, like Chris was saying, but they had to give them the equivalent of 20,000 without them ever selling it. And then once they started selling them, they had to keep giving them money. So there is quite a bit of money. And Simon Owen, who is on quite a few forums, stuff like that. I mean, he's to John Gitt's point also about branding and control and stuff. Hornby focuses on the UK, the US, and Australia, and everything else is kind of like North America. Apologies, I keep forgetting that. I used to be very good at not forgetting Canada, but so they also have to really, really concentrate on brands that they know those people will recognize. I mean, Jägermeister is probably the biggest exception. They do a ton of Jägermeister liveries, but most of the time that's why they do so many Golfs. There's some people they're like so sick and tired of the Golf livery. Well, everybody knows that in those countries. And then there's just so there is quite a bit of money involved, and there is an awful lot back. I mean, I used to work in sponsoring as well, so I also found some of the stuff that people were complaining about. It's like, I mean, really, you're so full of yourself. I mean, Jesus Christ, things like 5 millimeters over to the other side is going to be fine. Now, there was a European Union decision. I'd have to dig it out. It's quite a few years ago. Porsche sued a toy manufacturer for making a Porsche 911, I think it was. They never called it the Porsche 911, but the thing was really, really well done. And they basically said that you can't trademark or copyright forms. You have to get the permission to use the name. They can't sell it as a Porsche 911, but there's nothing against the form. And it was in a trade magazine for the toy industry, and they basically, the rough translation of the title was "Toy Makers Go to Town." You can make any kind of form you want, but like so many of these court decisions, I think the big brands still somehow put the thumb screws on people, because I've not seen a plethora of models coming out. Like
I know in Canada our copyright legislation hasn't really changed since 1922, and the line that everybody jumps on is if you make a material change, define material change, and that's a lot of things. And really, what it boils down to is a meeting between lawyers and accountants to see, is this worth going after?
Yeah, it's like here in Germany, of course, it's against the law to put certain symbols on certain World War II vehicles. For the longest time, the way they would get around that is they would cut it up into lots of different pieces on the decal sheet, and then you would have to put it together yourself. So they never printed it, but that was sort of a loophole. So yeah, because that was a material change. But yeah, like I said, that's something I remember. I'd have to dig that out, but I was always surprised that not more cars didn't start showing up because of that. I mean, look, Hornby to this day is making fantasy cars. What is it? Razio, Welsh word, Razio, Welsh word for race. It doesn't look like anything out there.
Well, the other thing too is, heaven help the large corporation that comes out after the poor little cottage industry person. I mean, that's a PR nightmare.
But what about guys like Goodyear? I mean, how many times have you gone by a car and there's a blank space on the side of on the fender or on the roll under of the car, like on Clarence? There's a blank space where the Goodyear sticker should be, right? And you've got to go find a decal sheet somewhere and reinsert your own Goodyear.
Or Carrera putting Carrera on the side of their tires,
yeah,
even though it says Goodyear or Pirelli on the side of the car.
Yeah.
Those
are the kind of weird things that I worry about. On top of why do the manufacturers, the stock car manufacturers, not put the right helmets on drivers, particularly in open cockpit cars, right? That drives me nuts.
Well, I can understand the drivers, because if you have to get permission from a driver, good luck.
Well, contrary to that, all of the Fly F1 cars, whether it was Reutemann or Alan Jones or whoever they did on all their FW07s, all had unbelievably accurate helmets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, Chris, that might have been just a "we don't care, come and get us."
Well, it's also a cost, certainly a cost issue.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, most people who, you know, you could argue most models that are built and I see from show and tells on the various forums, very little attention is paid to any driver's helmets whatsoever. I mean, it's, or anything in the engine, like the body of the car is done well, and then the bloody driver's head's a hideous looking face. So,
yeah. And sometimes it's probably better that they don't try and do it. I don't think I've ever seen a pre-manufactured John Surtees helmet that looks correct. I have a slotted took a long time before they got Jim Hall and Phil Hill's helmets right. And even then, they still look like Star Wars Trooper helmets rather than racing helmets.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Thunderslot, and nobody who does a McLaren ever remembers to take the visor off of Profi McLaren's helmet, even though they get the color right. But yeah, those are the what you call it, the bead count, the rivet counter things.
Yeah, but that gives us all something to do, doesn't it?
I guess the first thing I ever do on any McLaren is cut the visor off.
I know we're running out of time, Greg, but that all this talk about cars and brands and stuff like that, I remember, you know, Dave Kennedy's been doing a series of, I think he's called them Slot Car Stories, really, really good videos, like where he talks about, you know, why the Firebird, well, also one of my favorite cars, has the license plate that it has. And he made a really good point that I hadn't thought about that. There's a huge glut in the market for these cars from the 70s and the 80s. There's hardly any of them out there. Maybe it's a question for another time.
I mean, maybe that's why there's the glut of the models, is because the real things are only in people's memories. I don't know. But yeah, we are running short on time. Does anybody have any last minute questions for our experts on topics that we have addressed today they'd want to circle back on?
Just one, Chris. How do you polish your chassis? Like by hand or?
Yeah, I keep swearing or keep telling myself I should buy a tumbler at some point in time, but I just, you know, put on the news and sit there with some fine cloth and maybe some Brasso or something like that and polish away.
So you don't even use like a little Dremel tool, you actually do it by hand?
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow.
I don't have the time for that.
I try fairly religiously not to have to do a lot of work. I try not to put a whole ton of, you know, I hate filing and chopping with an axe at solder bits and stuff like that. So I find if I put on very little, it's a lot less work to do. And I learned from a guy growing up who used to make slot cars that look like jewelry. And I just thought that that's what slot cars should look like. So
now how do you preserve your work? Because the brass would tarnish.
Exactly. So I post them when they're nice and clean and shiny, and then they go in a display cabinet and tarnish away from there.
So you don't like dip it in lacquer or anything like that? Or?
No. That's not. No. You can't clean a slot car chassis, and you can't dip it in any stuff. Right. It develops a really nice patina, and you know, in every few years, if I really decide to, I'll take one all apart and redo it. But there's no, you know, and they don't last that long looking that good. I mean, it's, you know, age creeps in pretty quickly.
There's a famous slot car racer up in the northeast of England, a fellow by the name of George Kimber. A lot of you guys in the UK may know him. When he's finished building and when he has cleaned everything up, he uses clear adhesive shelf lining paper or tape and he actually covers every square centimeter of the brass, top and bottom, with this clear tape. And he shapes it and cuts it around every solder joint and around where every piece of wire attaches. But every flat surface is covered in this clear tape, and they never corrode underneath that. But that amount of work, no thank you.
Excellent. And with that, we will go ahead and end the recording. Thank you very much for everybody who's attended the live chat and everybody who's watching later on. We will continue to chat after I hit the stop button. So for now, thanks for watching, and everybody wave bye-bye. Bye.